Hey everyone, we're back with another episode of WWBTD, What Would the Behavior Team Do? We are kind of continuing our last episode with our lovely guests from Restorative Practices, Deanna and Urwell. If you have not gotten a chance to listen to them or to our last episode, please do. They explain kind of the baseline of what restorative practices are and also what they do for the district. So please go back and listen to that if you haven't gotten a chance. And then our other guests on here, Ashley, Joy, and Jen, and I am Kate. Last episode we talked about kind of towards like the parent lens, right? Kind of more of a parent audience when it comes to restorative practices. And today we're going to direct this more towards educators, but of course everyone can get anything out of our episodes. So yeah, but before we dive in, it is February and it is Black History Month. And I wanted to ask everyone here what they're doing to honor Black History Month. What are you doing to recognize it, to celebrate? I'll just start off for our supervisor, Michael Sykes, kind of gave us the task to find a quote from someone like that's not just the most common people that we always hear about, like MLK, maybe someone you haven't heard of, and to share that quote with a not a family member, just someone you love. And I thought that was really sweet. But in addition, I think it's all about kind of celebrating Black people, not just the struggle, right? Which is kind of what is always focused on. And actually one of our other teammates who's not on here, Rachel, she sent out some movies that, sure, maybe some of them cover that struggle, but also kind of, hey, this is like celebrating Black culture. And I think for me, I'm going to try and aim to watch one of those. So I feel like I've just spoken a lot. Joy, what are you doing for Black History Month?
Actually, I did do something sort of significant, sort of broke the bank. I've had a bunch of books in my Amazon cart, and I just hit buy now. And most of the books came from the website Conscious Kid. So they're books that celebrate Black culture for with like younger kids. So I'm excited to read them and then just share them with all the students that I work with. So the one that I'm the most excited to get here is called Be You. It has just the cutest little cover of, I don't know, like sunflowers and a little Black girl. And I just am excited to read it and celebrate little Black families.
That's awesome. Ashley, how about you?
So I am, let me figure out how to say this. So I'm trying to make an effort to not do anything that I would do any other month. Because I want to celebrate and instill that in my child and even in myself? Absolutely. But I also know that there's a tendency to make things like this, like a cliche is not the word that I'm looking for, but to make it like we only do this and here it is, it's February, now it's time, or like after school program, almost optional, you know what I mean? And so I am, we are kind of focusing on people who are not often, like you said, people who are not often highlighted during this month, but that is also something that's like, but I'll do that in December too. I'll do that in July as well. And so I'm trying to make an effort to not make it like, it's Black History Month. What are we doing, son? It's like, no, we're going to continue on the journey of learning and growing and, reaching back ancestrally the way we've been doing, the way that I've like continuing the journey, just continuing in it, because I don't, at least for me, I just don't want to make it like, this is what we do in February and we can die down once March comes.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Ashley. It's such a good point. It shouldn't just be maintained to 1 month. You're absolutely right. Deanna, what are you doing?
Oh, and Phoebe today. I am, so a couple things that I have decided to do, particularly for the month, but also I think what Ashley is saying resonates with me as well, is just like I am a continual learner. And so whether that's celebrating or understanding more of historical events or struggles that I, myself have not experienced, I think that's something that I like to continue to explore, to be more aware and become more culturally responsive. Two things that I've been doing intentionally this month was my sister is a elementary teacher in Beaverton, Oregon, and I sent her a bunch of like elementary level books around Black history, and books around hair, books around how a white kid and a Black kid can be friends, and just like some of those really foundational pieces. So she received those not too long ago, so I'm excited to have her introduce those. And Beaverton is not a very diverse city, so I think it's important to bring awareness, especially at a young age. And then lastly, I have chose that for this month, if I choose to eat out, I will only choose to eat from different places that support Black lives. Or people of color, I think, in general, but really trying to be intentional around where I choose to eat and how to support, especially during a pandemic when that's a lot of income for a lot of people. And so trying to live more locally and give back to the community that I am learning to enjoy and love. So that's where I'm at.
That's awesome, Deanna. I like that because you can also, once you discover these places that you might not have gone to otherwise, that's something that you can continue afterwards as well. Awesome. You're well.
I think my answer goes along with Ashley's, where, I'm Black, Indigenous, and white, and a woman, and I don't think those histories are anything but human history. And I think the fact that it's separated is really why we suffer and treat each other the way that we do. So I think it should be a continuation of our continued learning and understanding of ourselves and other people in relation to each other. One thing I am pushing others to do from my community and other Black communities is to take free courses that are being offered on economics and trading, on coding as well for Black community members, so that they can actually level up and build their economic prowess and build their stance in the world. And I think if we're going to do anything, like, that history should be a part of what we know. It's your history too. Like, Black is our history, right? So it's like, how do we go beyond that and actually like raise up the economic wealth and positioning and education of Black communities? And that's where I am encouraging people to be focused on this month.
Thank you. Jen.
Wow, I love this. And I agree completely that it should be something ongoing all the time. I have two little children at home, a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old. I still think he's 4, but he's 5. And really just having those conversations, especially this month, it should be all year round, but unfortunately this month in school, they do a lot more of like readings and learning about Black history. And so really just having those conversations and letting the kids pick a book that they want to, read about, and really having those table conversations with my kiddos. I want to teach them young. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for sharing and for grounding us with, really, what's already been said. It should be a continuation. This is an ongoing process. I think we all here have a love of learning and continuing to be better and to spread that knowledge to better really everyone and kind of combat just anti-racism in general. So thank you, everyone. So getting back to the focus of our episode, restorative practices. We talked about them in the home. They, we say at DPS, they are in our schools, but sometimes that is not always super clear. Sometimes people have different interpretations of what that looks like. So I kind of want to tackle what maybe fake RP is and how does that differ from discipline? Deanna or Yerwell, if you want to take this.
I can jump in. So I think to start the distinction? I was going to say distinction. I'm not sure that's a word. So between the distinctions, so restorative practices is anchored in equity, and it's anchored in really foundational components around mindset shift, equity, repairing relationships, and being able to continue to grow relationships. When we look at what fake RP is, there's not a lot of difference between fake RP and discipline, because they're both rooted in addressing the action instead of addressing the needs and supports that are those root causes to why those actions are happening. And so when we think of fake RP, we might say, maybe to give a little bit of an example, is, there's challenging behavior in the classroom and the teacher wants to step out and talk to the student. So we still do that, right? And that could be considered restorative practices, but the teacher is still saying, why did you do that? Can you behave now? Can we do this now? All right, wonderful, awesome, let's go back in, right? That would be fake RP, because we're not actually saying, hey, what's going on right now? What's going on for you? What do you need? Like, oh, wow, it's extra loud. Maybe I can give you a pair of headphones while we do independent time. Oh, wow, okay, I didn't know that. Or, it's the curiosity, I believe, that's missing. It's the kind of the lens of understanding that time is yes, time is valuable, but it's also the time needed to continue and break some of those barriers that we continue to have in schools. So I'll kind of get us started, Nirwa, if you want to add anything, but I think that's really the biggest distinction, is thinking about what the mindset is going into the practices, and then also how are we actually utilizing those practices. A conversation could be just a conversation. It doesn't make it restorative just because you stepped into the hallway to talk to someone. So
yeah. I think that was a great definition. A couple of things I'll add that I think connect to what we talked about last time are that also what we find where there is usually fake RP happening, there is a one person or a couple people who own restorative process for the entire community or the entire school, right? So again, it's not a culture, it's not a way of thinking about our community and how we're helping children to grow within it beyond just the academic skills they're learning. It becomes this very like a role in a school that one person owns, which means that person owns the health culture of the whole school. And when we lose that one person, right, we lose the healthy culture. And then the other, I think, facet that connects back to what we talked about before is helping the learner, the scholar, even sometimes the adult in the situation, look at the difference between intention and impact, right? Where else do you learn that but in these scenarios where maybe your intention was to get people to leave you alone, but your impact is that you actually like hurt the whole class because of your behavior and you hurt personal relationships or things like that. And so the point of RP is to be curious, just like she said, to unpack what's happening and why, and then to move a little beyond that, which is how do you learn a new skill or a new behavior? Or how do we meet your needs so this doesn't happen again? Mm-hmm. And you also can't do that when there's one person that's doing that for the whole school.
Right. And I also feel like they end up being the disciplinarian, right? I mean, and again, it's not necessarily anyone's fault. I mean, there are some systemic issues because we simply maybe don't have the funds to have all of these separate people with their separate roles. Do you have like a suggestion? Like, should we discard discipline and just do RP? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
I think there's a huge opportunity for reframing, right? Or using alternative language. I think some of the things we talked about in the last video around using words like justice or consequences, discipline, like at this point in time, they have a very negative connotation, or they have a connotation that determines that there's going to be an outcome, right? There's going to be a specific kind of outcome, which is typically punitive. And so I think when we think about discipline, I don't think that restorative process completely eliminates using punitive practices, right? Like there is a time and place where there is still legal components, criminal components, right? Like there is that, but there is also restorative process and practices that can be used within those practices, like within those situations, even if it's not the initial like contact, right? So we could work with somebody to reintegrate them back into a community. We could work with them to better understand what caused them to do the action in the first place. Like there's lots of components that can still be used. And so to think of it as like discipline or something like that, I think, like I said, there's a reframing that can happen to still do what is, you know, needed to do for criminal or legal components, but also the reframing then can include components of restorative process. Does that make sense? I'm not sure I explained that very well, but.
Yeah, no, totally. Absolutely.
I think also from a trauma-informed perspective, right? Like from a trauma-informed understanding, all behavior is communication. So if it's behavior we don't like, is that disciplined behavior, or is that a communication that we need to unpack and figure out how to support, right? So I think pretty clearly discipline and trauma-informed perspective do not go together, like those words or those concepts. And you know, restorative process is a trauma-informed practice. It's taking that mindset and putting it into action of how you actually decide to react and behave and build things. So I think exactly what you said, we need a reframing, because the two do not line up. If we say that we're trauma-informed, then discipline is a power dynamic we're playing in. And why are we playing in that if that's the role of the judicial system, right? There should be a boundary.
I agree with that power dynamic, that a lot of times it turns into that power over, type of dynamic within the school building. And usually, like, I remember having a conversation with an RP and they're like, I haven't been able to do what I came to do yet, because I am only doing discipline. I am only doing getting called to put out the fires. And so that, like, just hearing you both say, a lot of times that weight gets put on one person to carry the health of the school, right? Because it is a healthy practice, and it is something, honestly, that shouldn't just be a sector. It should be like, how do we weave this within our structure and policy? So I guess my question would be, what advice would you give to an RP within a school building to kind of bring that culture? Like, how do they advocate for themselves? Because a lot of times it's like, no, this is the lane I was told to be in. And it is very hard for me to get out of this lane because that is how I'm seen here. So what are some first steps they can take to begin to make this a practice that's like, this is not a me thing, this is a we thing, and it needs to be a part of our culture, and let's figure out how to do this?
Well, I think I will just preface any answer we give by saying that you have to have supportive leadership, right? You have to have a supportive principal that is on board. If you're working in a school that is not on board, there's a limit to what you can do, right? It's how much room and space they're going to give you to help make those changes. So I just say that because I think we have to be fair to people, that they only have as much impact as they're allowed to in some positions. But starting from that caveat, right? If you're in a position where you feel like you've been hired to do that role, there's support, they're excited to actually be a trauma-informed school and to do things better, to have better outcomes. I think that then when you're in that situation, it starts with you first taking on the responsibility of education and leadership around that, right? So if you're going to be the leader of restorative process and bring training or education or a new perspective to it, right? Besides leaning on other experts to help you, which could be like us from the district or other people that you go seek out, I think it really comes down to first your knowledge and education, because in order to make any case or argument, right, whether it's to build something new or to fix something, you have to be able to present it very logically with sound information and sometimes research behind you to show that this is the way to go. And so I think that it starts with you. If you're not educating yourself and keeping up with what it really means to work in restorative process in the United States, what is happening in the United States, you're reading books, if you're not going to webinars, Deanna and I talk all the time about, especially since the shift to virtual life over the last year, there are literally every week webinars that you can be on, if not several, to be learning and engaging in like the most up-to-date information that exists, right? So I think that's the first thing. You have to really center in that and want to be a continual learner and an innovator, because there is no secret sauce or recipe for this. It's literally trying it out, right? And building culture and implementing other people's best practices and seeing how they work for your community, and then ideating that a little bit differently and doing it different to meet the needs, right? And so that means you have to be in it. Like, you have to really want to be on top of what's happening. And when you do that, I think you show up also not just more as an expert, but also with that like passion and enthusiasm that moves people, right? When you have data and you're moved by this new research that came out or this curriculum that you see working for another school, that engages people, that excites them. If you show up kind of like, can we do things better?
Right.
What are you going to do, right? You need a solution. And I think that's the other problem, is that you don't need to be the solution, but you have to realize you've got to come with an offering of some things to try, right? Which again means you've got to be up on it.
I'm wondering, because, you know, I come from a teaching background, and I just know that, like, especially these days, teachers have so much on their plate. What do you say to the teacher that's like, I don't have time for that? I don't have time.
Yeah, I think that's the number one thing we hear from everybody that we try to work with.
Yeah,
Teachers and, you know, anybody, right? And I think what I was saying earlier is around the difference between our authentic RP and fake RP is really around time, right? And so one argument I would make is, if you have a 60-minute class and you're working with the students from minute one of like, okay, get your books out, we're lecturing, or we're going to do this, we're diving in, we need you to read, all that, you know, whatever all of that covers. I don't do academics, so I stay out of that world for the most part. And so if you do that, and then all of a sudden you have challenging behavior for almost 60 minutes, right? It's one kid, then it's another kid, then we've got this, we've got that. You have essentially almost no time that you're actually focusing on academics. And so my argument is spending time to incorporate social emotional learning, whether that's 10 or 15 minutes or 5 minutes at the end, right? And kind of capping the 60 minutes with ways to build social capital and to build your class community and to understand individuals and what the supports are that are needed. Because if you spend 15 minutes at the beginning, you have 45 minutes or potentially 45 minutes of really strong instruction, right? And so it's kind of like, do you want like semi-instruction for 60 minutes, or do you want this really strong instruction for 45 minutes and feel that within that you're also building relationships and community and culture within your classroom? So I think that it's not necessarily that people need more time. I think it's the way that the time is structured and how they are utilizing that time that's causing maybe some opportunities for growth.
I love that. Yeah.
I wanted to say I think speaking more to like RPs in my comment, not so much teachers when we're talking about that one person who owns things. So I just want to say that I think it is different. I think though for teachers, I really encourage teachers to go research one other school system in another country and look at how they run their classes and what they're doing, because some do exactly what we do, some do a mixture of what we're recommending, and then some fully are like restorative communities that then get some education done, and they're actually the most successful. So we are not the model for the best education system in the world, right? Our kids are not succeeding the best. So why keep perpetuating this model? And I feel like that's part of it, is that teachers are saying, well, this was the model I was told, and I don't have time to do something different. And I honestly think it can be encouraging to see that actually there are other models and they are very successful. And what can you do that works better for you and your kids? So you don't have to go to every webinar to learn that. You can go research a couple journal articles, you know, a couple news articles. But I think that, again, that putting in new information, stirring up what you already think is correct or how things work, and then thinking about how you can do them differently, like being more of a creator, is really the important part of that.
I love that idea. And like, if there's, I don't know if you want to say any countries that you could say that, you know,
Good question too.
have these instilled in their system, but also, I mean, when I went to through my education for teaching, this is not what we were taught. I mean, it was, you know, controlling your classroom, managing your classroom. And like, how are we advocating to have these courses in part of teachers' studies? I think that's where you start from the beginning.
Yeah, we've been
Talk about it all the time.
Yes. We do, right? And I think Jennifer, you bring up a really good point. We teach people to control and manage. We don't teach people to be innovative and lead, right? We're keeping that mentality of structured, has to be done a certain way because this is the way we've done it for 200 years. Whereas if we shift a little bit, which really could be a shift of 15 minutes, right, in that hour period, you could see a world of difference. When I did do a small amount of teaching, I taught like art history and photography and all the fun stuff. So still stayed away from mostly academics. You know, we did stuff like that. And then other teachers would be like, why do you not have any office referrals? Why do you not have, you know, how come you're not calling the office every day? Why are, you know, I'm like, we're hanging out, like we're having a good time, like people want to come in and I'm greeting them, or doing some of these really, really small practices that really build up over time, right? Like I finally had a student after weeks of like, thank you for saying good morning to me. You're the only person that's ever said good morning to me in the school.
Wow.
You know, and so I had no idea. One is just, I tend to be a friendly person and like to talk to everyone, but not even realizing from a different person's perspective that was the only time someone ever said good morning, or that was the only time that they were greeted or smiled at or whatever. And so I think thinking about some of those things we take for granted can make a huge difference for a lot of our students. And that's, again, shifts in 10, 15 minutes in a class. So I think it's worth it. Maybe controversial. I'm sure if we had some teachers on here, they'd be like, but I still don't have time for that. But I think that I would continue to argue the same thing. So I think it's a shift in time, not adding more and more time or more work for people to do.
That's awesome.
I was going to answer your question about other countries. I'm actually going to not answer that and say that I think it might be even best to look at here in the country at Chicago Public Schools and at Oakland Unified School Districts. Comes from Oakland. They've been doing well in the United States, right? Where most of us are modeling after Oakland. So you don't even need to step off of our shores if you want to go research and learn about school districts who've been doing things differently and had different outcomes for a long time.
Thank you.
I think there's a lot of opportunity to see that in different ways.
Will do.
I also think this kind of goes back to learning the history of schools, right? Because if you do a little learning about the history of schools, it's not shocking that the whole structure is to teach domination over children because they were used to industrialize some communities into work and then to reform Black and brown children into service work, right? Into whiteness. And so, you know, when you go to that history of whiteness in connection to schools, we are perpetuating that exact same thing over and over and over again. And that's the whole point of breaking this cycle and actually having schools be what they have the potential to be, right? Which are community centers, which are the growing of our next leaders within those communities and of healthy relationships and communities, you know, within education. And instead we have really bad historical relationships to education if you are brown, Black, female, First Nations, the list goes on, right? So we're not coming from a history that worked. We're coming from a history of domination, and we need to get to a history of collaboration, of leadership, of innovation. And unfortunately, you know, we'll see how universities make that change and where and when, but our schools are still happening. So how are we going to make that change as we are in them?
Wow. We could almost end on that.
I was like,
pretty powerful.
Sit with that. I gotta sit with that.
Well, it's just like, I mean, I've thought about this before when like it's been explained about just exactly like why schools are the way they are. I don't know. Have you seen that? I think there's this guy, he does like those whiteboard drawings and he just like keeps continuing and like to explain a concept. That's where I think I saw it in like undergrad, but it's just, I guess I want to be able to end on a positive note though, because that seems like a really like big macro thing. And I'm just like, well, what the heck? How are we supposed to tackle that?
Yeah, I don't think we should end on that. I think it's an encouragement for learning history. I mean, how many people don't like history? I hear that all the time from people. Why did I learn that? I didn't need to learn that. And you honestly didn't learn all of history. So I feel you. Like you got a watered down, micro cut out piece of history. It wasn't that exciting. So now learn real history so we can all talk about, right, like why we are where we are. And I think that Black History Month points us in that direction, right? Women's History Month points us in that direction, that there are these missing pieces. And I don't think it's sad, it's just the truth. And that's how we can do better, right? Of realizing like, oh, all of us that are in education, we didn't join this to dominate children, right?
Right.
We joined to elevate children. We joined to help them find the best part of themselves, to love learning the way hopefully we do, right? So I think that there's actually a lot of hope in the fact that like who's doing this work, but how do we want to come at it differently? And that's that question I think we're all left at, is like, we were all trained to do things a certain way. I was too. How do we then retrain ourselves and retool ourselves continually through what we put into ourselves and what we engage in and how we live to do things a little differently, you know?
Right.
So it still starts with ourselves.
Exactly.
Right? Be the change, model that for our kids. Sorry, Ash, you're going to say something.
No. I'm agreeing. Like but what is coming up for me. So I remember in our last episode for parents, we talked about the fact that this takes time, right? Bringing this into our school system, because there's a lot of unlearning and relearning that has to happen. There are things that, like when you're trying to change something that's been happening for years and years and years, of course, you're going to come up on some barriers, right? Two questions. How do we come to a cohesive narrative within our district specifically? And again, this may not be a question that can be answered, but just just thoughts around it. Like, how do we come to a cohesive narrative about what this actually looks like in our schools? And how do we begin to create a game plan to implement it? Like if I was a leader within a school and I'm like, okay, I want to bring this within my building. I know it's going to take time. I know it's going to take work. What is the recipe for the game plan?
Well, I'm guessing Deanna was going to say this, so feel free to add to it. When we talked about Chicago and Oakland, start there. So they both have two of the best comprehensive restorative process implementation guides that I know of or am aware of in the United States. Deanna and I regularly use pieces of that as well as point people to it all the time. And what each of those guides do is they take you through that exact process, Ashley, of what in a longitudinal several year process do you have to do, right? What are the roles you need within the school? What are the changes to discipline systems? I think that the Oakland Unified does a really good job of making it very clear that like to be different, you have to start with different conversations and relationships. And so they focus on how to center race and identity and all of the issues we have within our schools amongst that, like in conversations with students and with each other. Mm-hmm. So those are the steps, right? You get a guidebook, start, kind of checking them off. And luckily there's a couple really good ones that exist. I also will add that Deanna and I have put together a virtual training. It's called RP1. Yeah, and so we did that before COVID happened. We started working on this because we saw that there was a need for more people to get comprehensive training and to have a clear understanding of what restorative process is throughout schools. And the way we were doing it before just wasn't really available to everyone. So we made it more available. So now you can do this with your teams, you can do this on your own. And we are here to support you in that, right? So you can do the training and the quizzes and just get the knowledge, or you can go deeper and work with Deanna and I, and we offer trainings as well, can come in and work with your teams in schools to do more deep dives.
I think I would just add to that. I know we're getting ready to wrap up. I saw the hand, Kate.
Get close. Please go on.
The last thing I would add is just advocacy. So I think, a role that Yerwa and I play often is around advocating for the correct restorative practices, right? To advocate where maybe it seems like more pushback than advocating, but really the bottom line is to help build this narrative across other departments and districts. And even when we go into schools, sometimes we have to say, let's try it this way. Let's do this. Or actually, when we do this practice, we're perpetuating all of the inequities that we're already here to solve, but we're actually not doing that. So part of it is, having tough conversations and trying to work with people to do the unlearning. And that, is very hard. And there's been a lot to sit and unlearn now. So it's definitely a process, but I think as we continue to give those implementation guides, provide, standardized type trainings, and to really be able to say, here's a ton of information, go with it. We also have to kind of keep people in that bubble, right? And kind of like guide them down the path of like, oh, we're kind of getting off there, or, oh, that's not quite what we were thinking about when we were thinking about this type of procedure, or, so I think there's a lot of that kind of try to keep people on track, because the thing that I love most about restorative process and the work is that it's so individualized, and it is truly about relationships and being able to address unique needs and supports for students and staff and whoever's involved. But that's also what makes it the hardest process to implement, is because you can go one place and it works this way and you think, I will just do that, but you have a whole different demographic in your building, or the size, or the age, or the staff, or whatever it is. And so you're like, well, I tried all the things that they did and it didn't work for me, right? And you're like, okay. So it's the best part of restorative practices, but it's also the hardest part of restorative practices. So I think I say that as, yes, it's a challenge, but it's also a way to continue to grow and think about, the context of your building or your community. It's a place to start.
That's really encouraging that it is individualized. I don't think I had that in my head about it. So I think that's really cool. Yeah.
I agree, Kate. It made me think about, like, even as, just thinking about parents, like if I take it down to a level that I can, understand and look at, like, what may work in Jen's home, what may work in Joy's home, like, our relationship, yes, but it's like, well, no, my son may not respond to that, or, whatever. So that just made me, like, it was like a light bulb for me, Kate, like, oh yeah, like process, relationship, like what works in your community, like that. Yeah, it came up.
Well, and it's so different than what we typically do, right? Because we are a system of standardization, right? And so there is a way to standardize, like we've been kind of talking about, of like building a cohesive narrative of what it is. But when you get into those nitty-gritty practices and what it is you're doing, there's questions, right? Like, why didn't you do the same thing with Kate as you did with Ashley?
Right.
Well, they don't have the same needs, right? Like, I might work with Kate more because of X, Y, and Z, or Ashley needs a certain type of this or whatever. And so sometimes when other people or outside perspectives are looking in, they're like, but you're not being consistent. You're not doing the same things. But I think that's what is the most valuable piece, right? Is that you're not doing the same things because you're not trying to push people into the box. You're really actually eliminating the box and giving any amount of options. So again, the best part and also the hardest part, but I think that's what makes it what it is. And I think that's where we see the true building of a positive community and culture, and really diving into relationships and what that really, can consist of.
Do you guys offer like trainings for, not just necessarily for schools that have adopted these practices, but for families, like, so that we're really building that stronger community by giving these tools to parents as well, so that they understand what the school culture is moving towards, and can hopefully reinforce that at home. Just wondering if you have any of that stuff for the families.
We really encourage and are actually excited to say it's happening in many schools for the schools to do this, right? Because again, it's about that community relationship, which we do not have with them, nor will we continue to have after that training that they go through. And so it's really about learning to be in community and to ask questions differently, creating vulnerability and sincerity, right? And again, we can only do that for a few hours. So what we really do is work on supporting schools to build their restorative practices. And part of that, the thing about restorative practices is that it is community engagement, which is why it can't be one person. and which is why parents and homes should always be involved, right? It should never just be teachers with kids or principals with kids or whatever. So we highly encourage it. Like that is actually part of the process that again is laid out in those kind of guide maps, which is that like you're not restorative if families are included, right? So yeah, that's part of what we're training and supporting is for schools to be able to get to that point and to support that in the way that their school needs, right? You know, a lot of schools also are doing trainings in Spanish or Arabic or other languages that are needed in their communities. And again, that's really like getting to that point of building community and meeting need. So we highly encourage it. Excited to say it's happening quite a bit, but also that's why the school has to be bought in. That's the thing, like if the school's not practicing restorative practice, basically we're going to teach the parents something the school doesn't do, right? So it has to start with that like centering of leadership from the school community.
Awesome. I think this is exciting information for us because we're in different buildings, you know, all the time. And I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, are there more than 2 of you on your team? Wow. So it's exciting to me to just be able to spread this process throughout the buildings and just to continue to support schools to grow and get better at what we do. So oh my gosh, thank you for taking on the weight of a really big school district with what you guys do.
Yeah, I agree. I just think even though there are only 2 of you, it's so wonderful that we and other schools can still lean on you to have that guidance. And I also think, how hopeful it is that there's almost like rubrics laid out, other people are doing this. We don't have to start from scratch. And then of course you adapt to your school's needs. So it's just really cool. I'm so excited that we've been able to collaborate with you, as Joy said, and kind of continue to push this work. And that this is kind of hopefully where DPS is headed to really adopt this district wide. I want to thank you both for taking the time. I know we were able to steal you for 2 episodes, and it's just been absolutely amazing. I know we talked about other resources in this episode. We will certainly post those. And yeah, just thank you again. We will see you next time.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it was great to be here. We appreciate you spreading the message. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.